Hi, Braden. I just wanted to be able to talk with you real quick about your paper. You've done a lot of work here, which is excellent, but there are a couple of big things that we need to try and discuss before tomorrow. First off, your introduction right here is dry. Homicide is the legal term for this, manslaughter, self-defense. As I'm walking down through the beginning of this, I want to fall asleep already, and this is an issue I should not want to fall asleep through or about. Baltimore is not that far from Frederick and where we live. Does any of this ever spill over into the rest of the state? Murder in general is not something that's a laughing matter, and which should galvanize public interest and hopefully support. But you've made this very dry. Can you pick a personal, not a personal case, but a case as something that can be related to the reader, something that can be drawn out, a shocking instance or just a mundane instance, but something that's so mundane that we should be paying attention to it? Anyway, there needs to be some other sort of lead in right here. This then breakdown of Baltimore and what it is, I think, is very interesting, but I think it needs to include some of the information I gave you before about redlining and the history of Baltimore. Baltimore was largely populated by African Americans during the Great Migration, which occurs during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. I think that's one of those things that you have got to talk about if you really want people to understand what's happening in Baltimore and how the city is so segregated, and how that segregation then leads to some of the crime rates that are happening right here. It's one of those issues that has to be discussed. Beginning with Freddie Gray, actually, maybe this is the case that you should use back at the beginning. It is a shocking case, but also mundane. If you began with this and then jumped into the issue of after Freddie Gray's death, there were 343 homicides in 2017. Thus, it seems that for a city that is only 98 or 92 square miles, there is a real problem going on here, and we as Marylanders need to do something about it. Now I'm interested. Now I care. Freddie Gray led to this potentially. There's a correlation cause issue there, but let's just roll with it for right now. Freddie Gray led to this. Maryland is not that big of a state. Baltimore is not that big of a city, and we as people living in that state and near the city should care about it. So what are we going to do? So maybe think about that as some sort of way to reorganize and introduce your paper. Um, okay, now you start jumping down to the issues I was discussing with you before. Redlining. Great. Undesirable racial concentrations. Huh, great euphemism right there. There needs to be more here. This issue of redlining really needs to be opened up. You're not wrong to include it at this point, but we need some more quotes, some more studies to discuss how it actually affects the city of Baltimore. Yes, I agree with you completely that if we want to talk about the two cities of Baltimore, you can talk about the XY axis of Baltimore. On the Y axis, you have Charles and St. Paul streets, which run from downtown in the harbor up to Towson. That is largely a good neighborhood that runs straight through Johns Hopkins. And then you have the X axis, which runs around the harbor, includes the inner harbor from Canton, the neighborhood of Canton, on over to Fed Hill. That area is considered to be quite nice. But then the rest of the city, what you would call northeast and northwest Baltimore, largely is this other area that you're talking about, crime-ridden, impoverished, struggling is the short part of it. So being able to draw out that dichotomy and to maybe talk about how redlining has created those two Baltimores. Police officers. Having more police officers is one way to go about thinking about it, right? We need more police officers to cover this wide area. Another thing that might be interesting to think about, you discussed this before with two empty row houses, is it possible to, and this is the sociological term that's used here, decrease the footprint of the city, which is to say, would it be possible to just start demolishing huge chunks of the city that are no longer inhabited? The city of Baltimore, the population has fallen by something like 250,000 people over the past 30 years. So can we just get rid of all the neighborhoods that are no longer inhabited, or the huge chunks of neighborhoods that are no longer inhabited, and move people around? Could we reduce the footprint of the city and thereby make it the cops we have, or the cops that Baltimore has, are sufficient to cover the new ground that would exist because we got rid of much of the city that needs to be patrolled? That's something that could be worth thinking about right there. And that would go along actually with your issue of redlining. So the city was this large, the city was segregated, the city has been depopulated. Now should we reduce the footprint of the city, again playing with geography, in order to help resolve this issue? I think that could be an interesting thing to consider. Two pieces that I think that you should look at. I was just reading a piece in The Atlantic about an astrophysicist who was creating algorithms to help the city of Baltimore know which townhouses to destroy. If you go to The Atlantic, astrophysicist, do a Google search for The Atlantic, astrophysicist, housing in Baltimore, something like that. It should come up and give you a sense for what's being done right there. Um, at the same time, a person who's actually from Baltimore and has lived out many of these issues is a gentleman writing right now named Ta-Nehisi Coates. His last name is Coates, Coates. He writes extensively, again, in the Atlantic about issues of race in America, and he's from Baltimore. He has a lot to say about this, something I think that you should maybe play into. Those issues seem like they would be far more pertinent to me than what's going on right here with questions of robots. I just don't see that being anything that anybody's going to be in for. People, many African Americans in Baltimore, other cities like that, already think that the city is occupied by the police and by other um, groups who do not have their interest in mind. So that's something that you should maybe be thinking about. Um, Anyway, I'll try to provide you with a couple different ways to think about this, some different places to go for more information. On the whole, I can tell you've done a lot of work. Do not take any of the things I've just said as criticisms of what you've done. I'm simply trying to take what you've done and open it up and to go further. You've done a lot of initial work. Now let's try to take it even farther. All right, think about what I've had to say, and I will see you tomorrow.